Valerie Monroe was heading home from court, dressed sharp, calm, and confident. But to Officer Ryan Calder, she looked out of place. Without a shred of evidence, he handcuffed her on the spot, ignoring her rights and her silence. What he didn't know, Valerie isn't just another woman walking through the wrong neighborhood. She's the state's chief prosecutor, and she's about to turn his world upside down. Why did she let him arrest her without saying a word? What was she waiting for? Hit like if that gave you chills, subscribe for more, and let's get into this story. It was a sticky Atlanta evening. The kind where the air clings to your skin and time seems to drag just a little longer. Valerie Monroe stepped out of the marble-columned Justice Building, her heels echoing across the pavement like punctuation. Navy blue suit, white blouse, leather briefcase in hand, she didn't just walk. She moved like someone who belonged anywhere she set foot. But not everyone saw it that way. Just a few blocks away, Officer Ryan Calder leaned against the steering wheel of his cruiser, eyes dull with routine. His partner, Officer Elena Ruiz, tapped through reports on the MDT. Dispatch crackled. Be on the lookout. Female suspect. Late 30s to early 40s. Dark attire. Maybe carrying unauthorized digital files. Last seen near Peachtree in Auburn. Ryan sat up. He scanned the sidewalk, and there she was, walking alone. Confident. Too confident. You see that, he muttered. Ruiz glanced up. What, the woman with the briefcase? Yeah, that's her. Could be anyone, Ryan. He was already pulling into traffic. She fits the profile. We check it out. The cruiser rolled up beside Valerie. She stopped mid-step, calmly turning toward them. Her face was unreadable. Evening, ma'am, Ryan said, stepping out. Mind telling me what brings you around here tonight? Valerie looked him over once, then spoke evenly. I work downtown, just left the courthouse. Ruiz stayed by the door watching. Ryan took a few steps closer. What do you do at the courthouse? I'm in law, she said simply. That's so. He gestured toward the briefcase. You carrying anything we should know about? Legal documents, Valerie replied. Private and protected. Ryan narrowed his eyes. You're gonna need to open that case. Valerie blinked once slowly. No, you'll need a warrant for that. Ryan's jaw tightened. That calm tone, that cool confidence, it hit him wrong. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not by someone who looked like her. You refusing a lawful request, he challenged. No, she replied, her voice still smooth. I'm refusing an unlawful one. Ruiz shifted beside the cruiser. Ryan, let's not escalate. She's acting evasive. Valerie held her ground. I answered your questions. I've done nothing wrong. If you're detaining me, state your cause clearly for the record. Ryan stepped closer now, face to face. You're being difficult. I'm being lawful, she said. That was it. He reached for the cuffs. Turn around. Valerie didn't move. She didn't panic. Her voice dropped into something cold. You're making a mistake. Ryan grabbed her wrist. No, ma'am, you already made yours. Click. The cuffs snapped on. From across the street, a man paused mid-step. Someone else lifted a phone. A camera began recording. Ruiz looked uneasy now. Ryan, you sure about this? She's non-compliant, acting suspicious. We'll sort it out at the station. Valerie turned her head toward the man filming. Her face was calm, too calm. Keep filming, she said. Ryan tugged her forward. You can save your speeches for the judge. Valerie didn't resist. But as she slid into the back of the cruiser, she said quietly, almost to herself, I intend to. Ruiz climbed into the passenger seat, not saying a word. She stared at Valerie through the rearview mirror, a mirror that reflected not fear but precision, intent. Back on the sidewalk, the man lowered his phone. Man, he muttered to no one in particular. She didn't look scared. She looked ready. The patrol car hummed through the streets, but the silence in the back seat was deafening. Valerie sat with her hands cuffed in her lap, her eyes locked straight ahead. Ryan glanced at her through the mirror more than once, waiting for her to say something. Anything. He smirked to himself. You know, he said, keeping his voice casual, most folks at least try to talk their way out of a mistake. Valerie didn't flinch. She blinked once. I mean, he continued walking alone at night in a suit like that, carrying a locked case. You had to know how that looks. Still nothing. Ryan chuckled. Suit yourself. Just don't say I didn't give you a chance. He was trying to provoke her. You could feel it. Like a kid poking at a dog behind a fence, hoping it'll finally bark so he can call it dangerous. But she wasn't playing that game. She didn't twitch, didn't roll her eyes. just stared at the back of his head like she was watching a bad movie she'd already seen before. When they pulled into the precinct, Officer Ruiz hesitated before stepping out. She opened the rear door slowly, watching Valerie as she got out. And for a second, just a second, you could tell Ruiz wasn't sure what they'd just brought in. Valerie stood tall, straight back, shoulders square. She walked through those station doors in silence, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of someone measuring every step, every face, every flaw in the system she was walking through. They processed her like a suspect, took her fingerprints, logged her possessions. Ryan whispered something to the desk sergeant and walked off pretending to be busy. Ruiz lingered. "Can I ask who you said you worked for?" she said softly. Valerie met her gaze, calm, controlled. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied. That should have been the moment Ruiz stepped back. Should have called someone higher up. But she didn't. Maybe she was scared of causing a scene. Maybe she didn't want to challenge Ryan in front of the others. So she followed protocol. And that silence, the silence of good people who know better, echoed louder than any insult. When Valerie was finally placed in a holding cell, she sat down slowly on the metal bench. She didn't lean against the wall. She didn't hang her head. She sat upright like she was in a courtroom, like the hearing had already started. There were no cameras in the cell, just the flickering overhead light and the sound of boots moving past the hallway every so often. She looked straight ahead, barely blinking eyes, quietly scanning everything. The chipped paint, the rotation of guards, the time between checks. She watched the officers speak to each other in hushed voices, tracked how long it took before anyone brought her water. She noticed when they skipped protocol, skipped procedure, skipped decency. And still she said nothing. No outburst, no declaration. She had asked once calmly, "I'd like to speak to my attorney." And when they told her she could wait, she stopped speaking altogether. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood something deeper than fear. She thought it just once as she sat in that cell, her hands still faintly marked by the cuffs. If I speak now, I stop the system from exposing itself. That was the power in her silence. Not submission, but strategy. Every second she sat there, the department dug its own hole. Every minute she was denied her right. Every glance, every offhand comment from passing officers, all of it became evidence. Not just of a mistake, but of a pattern. And when the moment came when the curtain finally lifted, they'd have no idea what hit them. Because while they were trying to break her, she was documenting them. Every word, every failure. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was the sound of someone letting justice walk right into its own trap. The property room was quiet. Too quiet for Officer Elena Ruiz's nerves. She stood alone under the buzz of fluorescent lights, holding Valerie Monroe's briefcase in gloved hands. It was part of standard procedure. Open it, log what's inside, make sure nothing dangerous slipped through. But something in her gut already told her this was no ordinary suspect. She popped the clasps. Inside, nestled in a velvet pouch, was a leather ID holder. Ruiz opened it and froze. Chief Prosecutor, State of Georgia. She blinked as if her eyes were playing tricks. Read it again. The seal. The credentials. The expiration date. It was real. Official. Unmistakable. Her stomach tightened. Chief Prosecutor. She stepped back from the table. The words repeated in her mind, louder now, echoing with every second that passed. She turned quick, heading down the hallway. She didn't even knock when she walked into Lieutenant Keller's office. He looked up from his desk, mildly annoyed. "Sir," she said, holding the ID in her palm like it burned to touch. "We've made a mistake." Keller barely glanced at it. "You sure it's not fake?" "No, sir. I checked it twice. The watermark matches state format. Her name's in the system. She's the chief prosecutor." Keller rubbed his face. "Damn it. So, what do we do?" she asked, almost hopeful. But Keller's eyes didn't light up with urgency or concern. He leaned back and said flatly, "Nothing that leaves this room. Handle it internally." Ruiz blinked. "Sir," she was uncooperative. "The report stands. No need to make noise unless she presses charges." But she didn't resist. She didn't even— "I said handle it," Keller interrupted. "Let it go." And just like that, the weight shifted. What should have been a turning point became a wall. Ruiz left the office holding that badge like a secret that shouldn't exist. Later that afternoon, she sat in front of the patrol car's dashcam system. She needed to see it for herself. Something in her bones demanded it. The footage started. Valerie walking, calm, alone, responding to Ryan's questions clearly. Nothing out of line. Her voice was even, measured. When he demanded access to her case, she refused with perfect legality. No raised voice, no attitude, just law. Then the cuffs. On what grounds? Because she was composed, Ruiz paused the footage. Her fingers hovered over the playback bar. She knew what this was. She'd seen it before, just not this obvious, not this cruel. Ryan walked in behind her. "You watching the video?" he asked casually. Ruiz didn't turn around. "Yeah. She played the victim card in there too." "She didn't resist," Ruiz said quietly. Ryan shrugged. Being slick isn't the same as being clean. Ruiz turned to look at him now. Her voice was still calm, but firmer. She followed the law. "She played it," he snapped. "Big difference." There was a pause, a long one. Ryan stepped closer. "Don't cross the line, Elena. Especially not for someone who just plays smart. You've seen what happens to officers who forget where they stand." Ruiz didn't reply, just watched as he walked away, whistling to himself. Back in holding, Valerie remained where they left her. She hadn't moved much, still upright, still silent. But this time, her gaze wasn't drifting across the walls. It was fixed, steady on the little security camera embedded in the top corner of the cell. A single blinking red light. She was staring straight into it, not afraid, not pleading, daring it to look away. To anyone passing by, it would have looked like a woman sitting in silence. But if you looked closely, if you listened past the stillness, you could almost hear what was building underneath. She wasn't just waiting. She was watching them crumble. By the time the courtroom filled that morning, no one really knew who the woman sitting at the defendant's table was. And that was the point. Valerie Monroe sat alone, straight-backed in a navy blue suit, the same one from the night before. There were no cuffs now, no guards by her side. She placed a single file folder on the table and folded her hands. No lawyer, no entourage, just her. The whispers came fast. "Why's she by herself? Did she fire her attorney? She doesn't look like a defendant." Judge Halbrook shuffled through the docket, furrowing his brow when he saw her name. "Ms. Monroe," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I see you're representing yourself this morning. Is that correct?" Valerie stood slowly, every movement precise. "Yes, Your Honor. I waive counsel. I'll proceed pro se. You are licensed to do so." "I am." Her voice didn't waver. She didn't need to explain further. The judge studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Proceed." From the other side of the courtroom, Officer Ryan Calder leaned back with folded arms, expression unreadable. The look on his face wasn't worry, it was arrogance. The kind of arrogance that only comes from someone who believes the game is already won. Next to him, Assistant DA Lauren Tate Young Sharp Eager rose from her seat. "Your Honor, the state would like to call its first witness, Officer Ryan Calder." Ryan walked to the stand like he owned the floor, swore in, settled in his chair. Lauren stepped forward. "Officer Calder, please walk us through the night of the incident." Ryan adjusted the mic slightly. "Around 9:46 p.m., I observed the defendant walking alone near Auburn Avenue. Female dark clothing matching the dispatch description of a possible suspect involved in a data breach. What stood out to you about her behavior?" "She refused to answer basic questions, avoided eye contact, wouldn't allow me to inspect her briefcase. That raised immediate red flags." "Would you describe her behavior as aggressive?" "No, not aggressive," he said carefully, "but calculated, evasive. She was too calm, like she had something to hide." "Was she carrying any identification?" "She claimed she did, but refused to show it." Valerie, seated quietly, didn't so much as blink. Lauren nodded. "Did she resist arrest?" "No," Ryan admitted. "But she questioned everything. Quoted laws like she memorized them. It was like she was playing games." At that, Valerie's eyes lifted briefly. Not startled, not angry, just watching, measuring. Lauren turned to the judge. "No further questions at this time." Halbrook looked to Valerie. "Would the defendant like to cross-examine the witness?" There was a pause. Valerie stood up slowly, walked to the center of the room without notes or papers. Just her. She looked at Ryan for a long time before speaking. "You say I was suspicious." "Yes." "You say I was uncooperative." "You were. And your conclusion was based entirely on how I looked, how I walked, how I didn't panic when you threatened arrest." "I followed my training," Ryan snapped. "You refused inspection. That's suspicious behavior." "Suspicious," she repeated slowly. "What does that word mean to you, officer?" "It means something doesn't fit. And what exactly about me didn't fit? He hesitated just for a second. You were too polished, too poised. People walking at night don't usually look like that. Not in that part of town. Valerie tilted her head. So your justification was I didn't look like I belonged? He didn't answer. The silence did it for him. She turned back to the judge. No further questions. She returned to the table, sat down, and then did something unexpected. She looked around the room slowly at the judge, the clerk, the gallery, even the bailiff by the door. And then she leaned back, calm as ever, and said it just loud enough for the microphone to catch. Let them speak. They'll do the damage for me. For a few seconds, no one said anything, but the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressurized, ready to crack. Because in that moment, you could feel the shift. The courtroom was no longer watching a trial. The courtroom was inside one, and the woman at the defendant's table had just turned the lights on. There's a moment in every courtroom when the air shifts, not because someone raised their voice or slammed a fist, but because someone said the one thing that couldn't be ignored. Valerie stood from her chair again, her voice calm, her posture still, but her words, they landed like cold steel on a marble floor. Officer Calder, she said, eyes fixed on him. Can you cite the code section that authorizes arrest based on professional attire? Ryan blinked. Excuse me, you claimed I looked suspicious because I was too polished. So I'm asking which statute allows you to detain someone for wearing a tailored suit after dark? He didn't answer. His jaw clenched. Somewhere in the gallery, someone let out a breath they didn't know they'd been holding. Valerie didn't smile. She didn't press. She just let the silence say what needed to be said. Then she turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into the record a reference to Title 18 U.S. Code Section 242, the deprivation of rights under color of law. The judge sat back, eyes narrowing. That statute, she continued, makes it a federal offense for anyone acting under official authority to willfully deprive a person of their constitutional rights. That includes unlawful arrest. That includes denial of counsel. Judge Halbrook gave a slow nod. Proceed. She stepped forward, not pacing, not posturing, just placing her words with precision. I was detained without probable cause. I was denied legal representation when I requested it. I was not informed of the charges against me until hours later. The officer testified that I was evasive, but the video tells a different story. The room stiffened. Ryan shifted in his seat. I'd like to request that the body cam and patrol car dash footage be submitted as evidence. The judge turned to Lauren Tate, who suddenly seemed far less confident. Ms. Tate. She cleared her throat. We do have the video, but we haven't reviewed it yet. Valerie raised an eyebrow. Then let's watch it together. The judge agreed. Play the tape. The screen flickered to life. The footage began shaky and grainy, but clear enough. It showed Valerie walking calmly alone. It showed Ryan and Ruiz stepping out of the cruiser. It showed the conversation that followed. No raised voice from her. No evasiveness. Just firm, lawful responses. I'm on a public sidewalk. My ID is inside a secured briefcase. If you have a warrant, I'll comply. If not, this is unlawful search. And then it showed Ryan grabbing her arm. You think you're smarter than me, he'd snapped in the footage. What are you hiding, lady? Back in the courtroom, no one spoke. Valerie let the silence breathe. Your Honor, she said softly, this officer violated protocol, denied me counsel, and arrested me on the basis of appearance, not law. Everything I've said is on that tape. She turned slowly back to Ryan. He looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence. The certainty in his shoulders had started to droop. Still, Valerie didn't gloat. She didn't need to, because the truth was doing it for her. I didn't come here to play victim, she said to the room. And I didn't come here to shout. I came here to show you what happens when power forgets accountability. She looked back at the judge, her voice steady but resonant. You arrested me because you thought I had no voice, but I brought the law with me. There was a weight in those words, not just because they were true, but because she said them without rage, without desperation. She said them with clarity, with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you're standing on solid ground while others are just making noise. The judge looked down at the papers in front of him, but his eyes weren't reading anymore. Ruiz, seated in the back, stared at the floor, guilt tightening around her spine. And Ryan, for the first time since the trial began, he looked like he wanted to leave the room. But Valerie wasn't done. Not yet. Not until the system that had underestimated her understood exactly who and what they were dealing with. And yet, she still hadn't said her name. Not all of it. Not the part that would change everything. Not yet. If you've ever been inside a courtroom when something truly unexpected happens, you'll know the sound it makes. It's not the gasp you hear in the movies. It's not chairs scraping or people shouting. It's silence. A silence so deep it swallows every breath, every thought, until all you can feel is the weight of something breaking loose. And that's exactly what happened when Valerie Monroe finally stood, walked to the clerk's desk, and placed a small leather badge holder face down on the wood. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The clerk, confused at first, flipped it open and froze. Then with trembling fingers she handed it to the judge. Judge Halbrook adjusted his glasses. He looked at the ID, then back at Valerie, then down again as if rereading the words might somehow change them. He cleared his throat. For the record, he said slowly, his voice now edged with something almost like disbelief. The defendant, Valerie Monroe, is chief prosecutor for the state of Georgia. There was a long, frozen second. Then everything shattered. Cameras clicked like gunfire. Reporters stood half out of their chairs. A courtroom guard dropped a pen. Ryan Calder went sheet white. And Valerie? She didn't move. She just turned slowly to face the room, voice clear but measured. Yesterday, she said, I sat here as your defendant. Today, I am the law you swore to uphold. You could hear a pin drop. I was arrested on a public street with no probable cause. I was denied my legal counsel. I was humiliated, restrained, silenced, not because I broke the law, but because I followed it too well for someone who looks like me. Her gaze shifted toward Ryan, who sat stiff and mute, as if each word stripped away another layer of his uniform. You assumed I had no voice, but I have one, and I know how to use it. Not to shout, not to threaten, but to hold you accountable in the same courtrooms you've disrespected. She took one step forward. I hereby request a formal inquiry into Officer Ryan Calder's conduct during and after my arrest. That includes failure to follow protocol, racial profiling, unlawful detainment, and obstruction of legal counsel. The judge sat speechless. But Valerie wasn't done. I also request an internal audit of the entire Midtown precinct. Every case Officer Calder was involved in for the past 5 years should be re-examined for patterns of misconduct. Judge Halbrook blinked. Ms. Monroe, she raised her hand slightly politely but firmly. Your Honor, this isn't about me. It's about every person who sat in this chair and didn't have a badge to prove they mattered. It's about the system being weaponized by those trusted to protect it. Behind her, Ruiz sank lower in her seat, the shame rising like heat on her neck. Ryan, he still hadn't said a word. His hands gripped the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him upright. And just when you thought Valerie might finally sit back down, she added one last thing. This court is not a stage. It's not a platform for pride or power. It is a mirror. And today it showed its reflection. Then she turned, walked calmly back to the defendant's table, and sat. Not a single person dared to interrupt her path. The judge looked around the room like he wasn't quite sure what world he was still in. The same courtroom, the same bench, the same gavel, and yet nothing felt the same anymore. And somehow the loudest voice in the room was the woman who barely raised hers. When the courtroom heard those words, Chief Prosecutor, State of Georgia, it was like time skipped a beat. For a moment, no one moved. No one even breathed. You could feel the temperature drop a few degrees. And right there in the middle of it all was Ryan Calder standing frozen still in uniform, but stripped of any authority the badge once gave him. He didn't speak, didn't turn around, just lowered his eyes and clenched his fists. He looked smaller somehow, not physically but in presence, in power, in certainty. The kind of shrinkage that happens when arrogance meets consequences. By noon, the police department was under siege, not from protesters or cameras, but from truth. Within hours, Ryan was placed on immediate suspension pending formal investigation. But let's be real, this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about what they allowed him to represent. Lieutenant Keller, the same man who had brushed off Officer Ruiz's concerns the day before, now stood behind a podium with sweat forming under his collar. His voice was firm, but his words were hollow. "We are taking these allegations seriously," he said, eyes darting between reporters. "A review of procedure is underway. Any misconduct, intentional or otherwise, will be addressed." Intentional or otherwise, the crowd didn't buy it. Neither did the press. And definitely not the community. Because if Valerie Monroe hadn't revealed her identity, They all knew this story would have ended in silence, not spotlight. Meanwhile, inside the police station, Officer Elena Ruiz sat stiffly across from Internal Affairs. Her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles went pale. She had been called in to testify not about what she saw, but about what she didn't say. And now it was time to choose a side. I saw her badge, Ruiz said, eyes on the table. Before she was booked. I recognized the seal. I even hesitated, but I didn't say anything. The lead investigator leaned forward. Why not? She swallowed. Because Ryan was right there. And Keller, they had already made up their minds. I didn't want to be next. There was a long silence, a heavy one. Then a second voice cut through from the glass observation window. It was Valerie. She had chosen to attend the testimony quietly seated behind the one-way mirror. Later, when given a chance to speak, she stepped forward. Calm. Composed. Her presence didn't need volume. It commanded attention just by being. I don't believe Officer Ruiz is the problem, she said, her voice steady. The problem is a culture that punishes honesty, a chain of command that values loyalty over law, and a silence so deep people forget what justice even sounds like. She paused, letting that land. I'm not here for vengeance, she continued. I'm here for something harder. I'm here for reform. Not just policy change, but cultural change. Because what happened to me is not rare. It's just rarely exposed. Those words lit a match, and by nightfall, the fire had spread. The video of the courtroom revelation went viral. Not just in legal circles, but across the country. People weren't just talking about what happened, they were talking about what it meant. Civil rights groups, former prosecutors, high school teachers, black veterans, mothers. Even retired officers came forward to say, this isn't just one incident. This is a mirror held up to a system that desperately wants to look away. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Keller was busy cleaning his own mess. He issued a new statement walking back his earlier remarks. But it was too late. Internal Affairs had already flagged his communications for obstruction and failure to escalate a known identity conflict. The department wasn't just under review, it was under fire. But perhaps the most powerful moment came quietly, without cameras, without press. Ruiz caught up to Valerie outside the courthouse near the parking lot. It was after sunset. No one was watching. She didn't bring excuses, just truth. I failed you, she said, her voice low. I knew you were someone. Maybe not exactly who. But I knew. And I said nothing. Valerie looked at her for a long time. Not with anger, with something deeper. Measured grace. You were scared, she said. So was I. But I stayed silent for a reason. You stayed silent out of fear. One is strategy. The other is survival. Ruiz nodded slowly, eyes glassy. I want to do better. Valerie didn't offer absolution. But she did offer something rare in that moment space. Then do better, she said simply. With every choice from here forward. That's all justice ever asks. By the next morning, media trucks were parked outside City Hall. Valerie's image was on every major channel. But what truly mattered wasn't her title. It was her message. One woman arrested for walking home had pulled a thread so deep it made the whole cloth tremble. And the system. It had started to shake for real this time. By the time Valerie Monroe took her seat in the civil hearing, the courthouse lobby was already flooded. Not just with press or city officials, but with ordinary people who had seen too much for too long. She wasn't there to defend herself anymore. She was there to witness what happened when one voice finally gave others the courage to speak. A court officer opened the doors to the gallery, and people filed in quiet but determined. The first to testify wasn't a lawyer or activist, it was a father. He stepped up slowly, gripping the edges of the wooden podium as if it might hold him up. My name is Joseph Dillard, he said, voice dry. My son Tyrell was 14 when Officer Calder stopped him for riding his bike home from tutoring. He fit a vague description, they said. That night he came home with bruises on his wrists and a stare I couldn't recognize. His hand shook as he held up a photo. This is Tyrell. Before that night. After... He stopped talking to people. Quit school last year. Told me he didn't think the world was built for boys like him. A silence settled over the room like a weight. Even the judge didn't look away. Then came the next witness, and the next, and the next. A woman in her 30s, eyes lined with exhaustion, stepped forward. I was pregnant when Ryan Calder pulled me over for drifting between lanes. I told him I was just trying to get to the hospital for a checkup. He said I was too emotional and looked nervous. He made me get out of the car, in the cold. 7 months pregnant. She paused, then looked toward Valerie. Back then, no one believed me. But seeing her up there, hearing what he did to her, I knew I had to speak. Then a young man barely out of college took the stand. He threatened to plant something on me, said I'd better be grateful he was having a good day. I thought maybe he was bluffing until I saw how fast his hands went to his belt. The city prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Cameras rolled. Valerie sat still in the gallery, not moving, her eyes locked forward as if memorizing every word. The courtroom was swelling with something raw like history forcing its way into the present. Then a bombshell hit. A reporter from the Atlanta Ledger stepped forward, waving a stack of documents. "These are sealed internal affairs records," she said, addressing the judge. "Obtained legally through a whistleblower provision. They show Officer Ryan Calder was investigated 7 times. Excessive force, racial profiling, denial of due process. All dismissed, not a single consequence." Gasps echoed. The judge banged his gavel for order, but the damage was done. That's when Valerie finally stood. She walked to the center of the room. No podium, no notes, just her voice. "There's a sickness in the system," she began. "Not just in the officers who abuse their power, but in the hands that keep signing off when they do." She turned to the panel of civil officials. "These stories you heard today, they were hidden. Not because the victims stayed silent, but because they were silenced." One of the council members leaned forward. "And what are you proposing, Ms. Monroe?" "I'm not proposing," she said evenly. "I'm demanding." She stepped closer, dropping a file onto the table in front of them. "I want the immediate formation of an independent civilian oversight board, with subpoena power, with community representation, with real teeth." Another official shifted uncomfortably. "Ms. Monroe, such a board would require rewriting oversight protocols statewide." Valerie didn't blink. "Then rewrite them." Her voice grew firmer, not loud, but impossible to ignore, because the alternative is doing nothing. And doing nothing has already cost too much. The judge tried to regain control. "Miss Monroe," but she wasn't finished. "I'm not standing here today as your witness, or even your prosecutor. I'm standing here as the result of your failure to listen, of this city's failure to protect its people from those sworn to serve." She turned to face the crowd, and I will not let it continue. A single clap broke the silence, then another, then a wave. It wasn't applause for drama, it was release, relief, recognition. Councilman Hargrove cleared his throat. "We will convene an emergency review session by end of week. Your proposal will be the first item on the table." Valerie nodded once, then returned to her seat. Her face gave nothing away, but her hands tightly folded betrayed the weight of what had just been set in motion. Outside the courthouse, protesters and supporters stood side by side holding signs, not with her name, but with their own. Because finally, someone had said what they all had lived. And inside that courtroom, for the first time in a very long time, the truth didn't need permission to exist. The verdict came in just after noon. The courtroom was packed again. Journalists shoulder to shoulder, families squeezed into the last rows, and city officials standing along the back wall like they'd just realized what silence could cost them. But this time no one was whispering. No one dared. As the jury foreman stood, the room fell into a tension so sharp it felt like the air itself refused to move. In the case of People v. Officer Ryan Calder, the foreman began voice steady on the charge of abuse of power under color of law, guilty. On the charge of civil rights violation, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of legal process, guilty. The words didn't explode. They settled. Heavy. Final. Ryan didn't flinch. He sat stone-faced at the defense table, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the floor, like maybe if he didn't look up, none of it would be real. But it was. And for the first time in his career, there was no badge to hide behind, no union rep whispering strategy, no quick out through procedural loopholes. The judge's sentence came swiftly. 5 years in federal custody, revocation of pension, and public disclosure of his disciplinary record going back 10 years. A ripple moved through the gallery, but no one cheered. Because Valerie Monroe wasn't cheering. She stood when the judge asked if she had any final remarks. Her tone was even, her gaze unwavering. I didn't come here to celebrate, she began. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like a reckoning. She looked at the jury, then to the rows of victims who had come forward during the hearings. We are told that justice is blind, but too often it turns its back. Justice isn't served when victims have to scream before they're heard. Justice is when systems hold themselves accountable without waiting for the storm. Her voice never rose, but it pressed into the room with quiet force. This was never about me. It was about a culture that teaches power is a weapon, that silence is weakness, that some people get questioned for walking home while others drive through life unchecked. Then she paused, letting the moment breathe. I'm withdrawing my personal lawsuit. Heads turned, murmurs erupted. Even Ryan seemed to look up confused. I won't take a settlement. I won't seek damages. Instead, I'm asking that the fines levied against Mr. Calder be transferred directly and fully into a new initiative, a legal literacy program for Black and brown youth across Georgia. They need to know their rights before someone tries to take them. For a moment, even the judge was still. Then he nodded once quietly. Outside the courthouse, a sea of microphones waited. Reporters called her name, begged for statements. Valerie walked past them. She didn't wave. She didn't pose. She didn't smile. Because this wasn't the end. It was what accountability was supposed to look like, measured, principled, and deeply human. And as she disappeared into the crowd, one thing was clear. She hadn't just changed a courtroom. She had changed the rules for how justice would be demanded going forward. Weeks had passed since the trial, but the city still carried the echo of it like a bell that had been rung too hard, too long. The courthouse wasn't quiet these days, not anymore. Protesters had turned into policy advocates. Reporters had traded scandal for follow-up. And in the center of it all was a woman who never raised her voice, but had changed everything. Valerie Monroe returned to the neighborhood where it all began, not out of ceremony, but curiosity. She had walked this street once in silence, in cuffs. Now she walked freely, hands in the pockets of a soft beige coat, her heels clicking gently against the sidewalk as the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the park. It was quieter than usual, but not empty. In the grass near the picnic tables, a circle of kids sat cross-legged, listening intently as a teenage girl stood in the center holding a sheet of paper like it was a courtroom script. "No, officer," the girl said, her voice clear. "You may not search my bag without a warrant or probable cause. I know my rights." The kids clapped. One boy whooped. Their instructor gave a proud nod. Valerie smiled faintly. Her eyes landed on the teenager, bright-eyed, determined, with a braid down her back and a spark that felt oddly familiar. The girl noticed her, hesitated, then stepped forward, just a little shy but holding her ground. "You're her," she said softly. "You're the lady from the video, from the court, the one who didn't yell, but still won." Valerie tilted her head. "I didn't win. I just showed up." The girl smiled, a little bolder now. "My name's Maya. I started learning law after I saw what happened to you. It made me mad, but it made me want to understand. So maybe one day I can stop it from happening to someone else." Valerie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a pen, a sleek, dark pen with a soft engraving etched into the side. She turned it in her fingers, then placed it gently in Maya's hand. "I used this when I wrote my first court motion," she said. "Now it's yours." Maya looked down at the inscription. It read, "Write your future. Defend someone's truth." Maya clutched it like it was made of gold. "I will," she whispered. Valerie didn't say another word. She didn't need to. She watched as the girl returned to her circle shoulders, just a little straighter voice, a little louder. That was all the answer she needed. That night, across living rooms and news feeds, a clip from Valerie's recent speech at the Georgia State Conference played on loop. She stood at a podium, no teleprompter, just her voice and the conviction it carried. "Justice isn't a destination," she told the audience. "It's not a moment you arrive at and rest. It's a discipline, a daily act of courage. It lives in how we speak up and how we protect those who can't fight for themselves yet, and in how we hold ourselves accountable, not just those we oppose." She paused before the last line. "It's not about who gets the last word. It's about who listens first." The applause was thunderous, but Valerie didn't stay long afterward. She never liked the spotlight. She never needed it. Later that week, as the sun dipped behind the Atlanta skyline, she walked alone down the courthouse steps. The same steps where they had once led her in chains. Now she descended with purpose, not bitterness. She paused halfway down, letting the warm light settle across her shoulders. There were no cameras, no applause, just the hum of traffic and the quiet realization that something had shifted not just in the city, but in the people. And as she turned the corner, her silhouette faded into the evening light. A voice echoed softly, not out loud, but in the hearts of those watching from afar. Some battles aren't fought with noise. Some revolutions walk quietly into history and leave the door open behind them. In a world where silence is often misunderstood as weakness, Valerie Monroe showed us that true strength lies in patience in principle and in the quiet refusal to be broken. This story wasn't just about justice served in a courtroom, it was about standing tall when the system expects you to bow and inspiring the next voice before yours even fades. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful narratives that speak truth to power. Your support isn't just numbers on a screen, it's the fuel that drives us to keep telling stories that matter, stories that honor dignity, expose injustice, and remind us that real change often begins with just one voice. At Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories, we help you remember them.